We go from back-to-back predators to someone who is rumored to have had a consensual affair with January Jones and had a child with her. Sadly, this is step up. Tonight, we are going back to the groovy 60s with X-Men First Class.
A new species is being born. Help me guide it. Shape it. Lead it.
Time for the tour.
You have no idea what I'd give to feel
Normal.
You want society to accept you, but you can't even accept yourself.
Should we have to hide?
Tomorrow, mankind will know that mutants exist. They'll fear us, and that fear will turn to hatred.
Not if we stop a war. Not if we risk our lives doing so. We have it in us to be the better men.
We already are.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
They're just kids.
No, they were kids.
You ready for this?
Let's find out.
The cost of freedom is always high. No one can foresee precisely what course it will take. One path we shall never choose, and that is the path of surrender.
Listen to me very carefully, my friend. Killing will not bring you peace.
Peace was never an option.
This is the Superhero Pantheon. On this podcast, we take one superhero film a week and decide whether it should be in the Pantheon, the Pile of Shame, or somewhere in between. My name is Jerome Cuson. You can find me on Twitter at JeromeC1985. You can find additional episodes of this podcast through Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and all of your favorite podcast apps through The Real World. We strongly encourage you to leave a 4 or 5-star review so as to help people discover this show and the great work that the folks at The Real World are doing. If you would like to interact with us or send feedback, you do so in 2 ways. First, send an email to superheropantheon at gmail.com. Second, find us on Twitter at Hero Pantheon. My co-host for this week and every week will be Brian. He can be found on Twitter at Brian DeBrain. Brian, I know this is an X-Men movie, unlike The Last Stand. Unlike X-Men Origins Wolverine, this is one that you have very much been looking forward to talking about because I think among us it's very good, and I think the general consensus is that sneakily this might actually be the best team-up X-Men movie ever produced.
God, I think so, man. I think this is one of those movies that I might die on a hill for, because like watching this again, it's so fun to watch. It's such a great fun watch, an experience to have, because basically when they go back to the 60s, man, that you can have so much fun when you have like a retro kind of movie, and they did that so well. And kudos to Matthew Vaughn. I when they announced him as director for this movie back in 2009 2010, I was stoked because I had just watched Kick-Ass, and I knew this guy had a sense of style, and you can see his sense of style throughout this movie. That it's the only X-Men movie that has this cool, funky, retro style. And then once you get to Days of Futures Past, you kind of see some of that, but then you kind of go back to that Bryan Singer kind of look. So to me, this is a very unique, and it stands out a lot. And I wish he took over the franchise from here, but it sucks. But he kind of got his own franchise with the Kingsman. But I really, really love this movie. I love its style. And man, the performances I think are probably, from here on out, I think it's probably better than the previous performances in the previous trilogy.
So I know what you're thinking, X-Men First Class. There is the possibility that we're going to get Cyclops, Jean Grey, Beast, Iceman Angel. These were, of course, the 5 original X-Men based off of the comic books. However, in this movie, really the only speaking role that we get is Beast. He's the only student from the original X-Men to appear in this film. There is an Angel, but it's not the same Angel, and we can get into some of the continuity issues that arise when we talk about X-Men Apocalypse, but we do get Scott's brother Alex in this film as he plays Havoc. In the comic books, Havoc is the younger brother of Scott Summers, but in this case, he is the older brother. And of course, Jean Grey, Iceman, Cyclops, they would all eventually go on to appear in other X-Men movies based on the timeline. Another thing you might be thinking about is Charles Xavier. Where is his shaved head? James McAvoy had shaved his head, and he soon learned that the filmmakers wanted Xavier to have a full head of hair in the prequel. He would also have that full, luscious head of hair in Days of Future Past and most of Apocalypse before he would finally shave his head just before the end of that particular movie. So originally, something else that they wanted to have happen was Bryan Singer to return as he directed the first 2 X-Men movies. He declined this due to his commitment to direct the all-time American classic, Brian, Jack the Giant Slayer. He was replaced by Matthew Vaughn in May 2010. Singer did stay on as a producer and, of course, would once again take over as well. So, Jack the Giant Slayer over X-Men First Class, huh?
Yeah, that's one of those totally forgettable movies, and I couldn't believe that Bryan Singer would actually do a movie like that, and that was a total flop. I think it's a blessing in disguise, man, because look, he would have done the same old boring X-Men movie, man. And I know that's what he would have done. I know he's a producer on this movie, but I think the change was very good, and it needed to be done. And it kind of like, you know, to me it felt like from here on out, just hearing the concept of First Class, they should have just hit the reset button completely with the new director. But because Bryan Singer was still attached, they kind of had it still tied into the original timeline. So again, with the timeline stuff. But yeah, I wish it was the original 5. And then just go from there, but, you know, they had to tie it in still. But, you know, he was still able to make it his own.
Of course, this is a prequel to the entire X-Men film franchise. We are not going to delineate the timeline because it is a mess, and we'll get into some of the ways that it is a mess throughout this podcast, I am sure. But this movie really does ignore a lot of the continuity points of X-Men, The Last Stand, and X-Men Origins Wolverine, 2 movies that will be wiped out of existence when we talk about Days of Future Past in 2 weeks. Matthew Vaughn explained his intention was to make a good film that could stand on its own 2 feet regardless of all the other films, and also that could reboot and start a whole new X-Men franchise. Some have also considered this something against the canon of the X-Men trilogy, possibly some alternate history. So really, if you're trying to delineate the timeline of the X-Men, you really just have to stop.
Yeah, man, because, I mean, even if you do the math, like, I don't know, like, Mystique's supposed to be 60 years old or something? I don't know. By the time you hit, you know, maybe even the second X-Men movie, who knows at this point, but yeah. And then the Angel thing was really confusing. That's why I wish it was just a complete reset, you know what I mean? And just, you know, get away from the old stuff. But again, because they still had, you know, Hugh Jackman under contract, they had to tie it together still, and I wish they wouldn't have done that.
I think one of the best things about this movie is the style, as you've mentioned. Matthew Vaughn wanted the film to resemble the production of the 1960s with very traditional framing, camera movement, not a lot of it, using the anamorphic format to create a widescreen experience, emblematic of 1960s movies. He had 5 cinematographers, one of whom received credit. That would be John Matheson, who came halfway through the shoot and did half of the film, and 4 assistant directors to successfully convey the look he wanted for this film. So something very, very specific and very impressive that he was able to pull this off. And all I could say about the style is it is very clearly established that this is taking place in the 60s, and it shows. And there's so many great set pieces. There's so many great needle drops, and we're going to be talking about those in the next little bit here. But any opening thoughts on the style of this movie as it did take place in the 60s?
I've seen Stardust, his previous movie. Actually, I've seen all his movies now that I think about it. But in Stardust, and even Layer Cake, you can tell that he takes his time with cinematography, and he's very specific, and he centers his shots well. And, you know, when he needs movement, he gives a lot of movement. And then when he needs that, you know, moment of of just peace and just like focusing on the drama and the acting. He just doesn't move the camera, and you get that with the Xavier, especially the Xavier Magneto chess scene in the movie. You get that feeling. So right from there, I knew, like, from watching Stardust and watching Layer Cake, and Layer Cake is kind of a confusing British crime movie, but it's very well, you know, you watch that movie, you're watching like a really high-paced movie. You know, I feel like he gets it, and his style fits this so well, because that 60s style, it felt like watching, like, you know, like a British crime movie, you know, from the 60s, with, like, I was expecting Michael Caine to pop up.
Well, it's funny you mentioned the 1960s cinema, as one of the most popular movies from that decade was Doctor Strangelove, and that war room set that you saw was intentionally identical to that war room, and I think that just kind of exemplifies the very purposeful look. And if you've never seen Doctor Strangelove, you should absolutely do that, because it is a phenomenal piece of filmmaking. Before we get to talking about the heroes, let's talk about some casting for this movie. The filmmakers had two choices for the role of Sebastian Shaw: Colin Firth and Kevin Bacon. They decided to go with Bacon as he was an American and seemed more menacing than Firth. This is a decision that I absolutely agree with. I think Colin Firth, I think he would have been fine, but I think Kevin Bacon, he's one of those guys who does not get the credit he deserves. But there are very few movies where I've watched Kevin Bacon and be like, he's not very good in this. I think he over-delivers in this role, quite frankly. And a lot of it is helped by kind of the design of the character, the look of the character. Colin Firth would go on to play a major role in Kingsman: The Secret Service. Kevin Bacon also said that he took the part of Sebastian Shaw because he strongly believed in the ideas that the comics represented. And apparently Kevin Bacon believes in the morality of the X-Men more than the filmmakers do. We'll get to some of those issues in just a few minutes, but any thoughts on Colin Firth and Kevin Bacon?
I just can't buy Colin Firth as like a bad guy. You know what I mean? Like, to me, he's too much of a good guy. And then you watch something like The King's Speech, and then you realize, man, how can this guy be a villain in like a movie? And I know he's probably played a villain here or there in a movie, and I just can't think of it right now. But to me, he's always going to be like a baby face, and like a soft kind of baby face. You know what I mean? So I couldn't have pictured him in this role. But Kevin Bacon, like, you're right. He's very underrated. I've loved him since Tremors. And, of course, he was really funny in Animal House for the small role he had there. And we can go throughout his entire career, but if you look at a movie like Hollow Man, right? As bad as that movie was, like, he was really good in that movie, and I'll give him credit for it. Like, he's very underrated. He can take, you know, crap and kind of turn it into something. And this wasn't necessarily a crap role. It just kind of felt like a generic kind of, like, you know, typecast kind of villain, but at the same time, like, right from the beginning of the movie, you can kind of tell he's kind of doing that Christoph Waltz kind of, like, you know, sadistic kind of psycho kind of thing right off the bat in the World War II setting. So I like that a lot in his performance, and he's really underrated. And from what I've heard, I've never watched The Woodsman, but I've heard he's really dark in that too. And he does like all these, you know, he does big production stuff, he does independent stuff, he's all over the place. And I really think he's an underrated actor, and you're right.
So let's talk about Emma Frost, who I think there's been a lot of discussion about January Jones in this role, both in the gossip pages and among film fans. There were a couple of other people who were considered for the role, and I'll be honest, both of these names sound like they would have been much more intriguing than what January Jones put on the screen. Rosamund Pike, who herself was in a James Bond movie, was considered to play Moira McTaggart, and later Emma Frost and Alice Eve, who is probably best known for her role in the Star Trek movies, was originally cast, but a deal couldn't be reached, and she was replaced with, and thus we got stuck with January Jones, who is, I would say, the least good part about this movie.
Yeah, man, I don't know why she was so one-dimensional. It was that weird, strange...
It's because January Jones is a good actor, that's why.
I didn't want to say that right off the bat, man, but yeah, I mean, I've watched an episode or two of Mad Men, but, you know, based on this movie and just remembering this from 2011, I'm just like, why is she so, like, popular? Is it just because of Mad Men? I guess it's just because of, you know, she was part of the cast and that was it, but she has no energy in this movie at all. She's probably worse than Femke Janssen as Jean Grey in, like, you know, X-Men 2, I would think. It's like... I don't know, man. Something was weird. The relationship with the director was probably weird as well, to go with that on top of that. So that probably gave, you know, this result of the performance.
So one of the things that was deleted, there was supposed to be a telepathic battle between Xavier and Emma Frost, which the idea of January Jones being involved in this is pretty horrifying. But because of the movie Inception, which had come out a year before, this concept was scrapped. But we would get to see it in X-Men Apocalypse, and boy, what a sequence that was! As we will talk about that in a few weeks. One final thing before we get to the heroes. Tons of notes for this movie, really. Matthew Vaughn instructed the cast to do away with all accents in their performances. James McAvoy had wanted to copy Patrick Stewart's voice. I'm kind of glad that they went away from that just so it didn't remind us of Patrick Stewart. And I think one of the things that I really appreciated about James McAvoy was that he very much made this role his own. And they also made Moira McTaggart not Scottish, so Rose Byrne got to use an American accent instead since she was involved with the CIA. And honestly, I'm really glad on both accounts because I really think that McAvoy, he's going to get compared to Patrick Stewart's performance, but the fact that he doesn't try to copy the accent, the fact that he's walking, the fact that he has a full head of hair, it almost creates a sensation of you're not seeing him in the same way as you would Patrick Stewart as Charles Xavier, and I think that's to his benefit because I think McAvoy gets to make this role his own, and I think he does a really, really excellent job.
Yeah, and Fassbender too. Like it's kind of the same thing. Like even though technically he's taller, he's much taller than Ian McKellen. You know, he just knocks it out of the park in this role, and you know he takes this role and kind of makes it like more than his own. Like it's way more dramatic and more emotional. And I love how they go back to that original scene. But yeah, like the same thing with McAvoy. He felt like a young, hip dude, and that's not what like Xavier feels like later on. But then you look at the time, and it's like, yeah, this is 40 years before the Xavier that we know, even in like the animated show, I think, because even in the animated show, it seems like he's in his 60s already. So this is kind of like the young 20s Xavier, and it's a good kind of fit, and it's kind of like that good look at like a person's lifespan to kind of compare. Like as a young guy, yeah, you were a completely different person by the time you get to your 60s. You're much wiser, you're much older, and then you can kind of get that sense of him being a teacher when he's trying to, help teach the kids to control their powers too in this movie. So it all kind of ties together, but it feels like the same guy, but you kind of get a sense that this is just a younger version and that time does change people.
Even though this movie, especially the first 20 to 25 minutes or so, are heavily focused on Xavier and Magneto, it feels like the character love gets spread around a lot more. It feels like more characters get moments to shine, so to speak. And as we talk about the heroes, talking about Xavier specifically, we see him portrayed as a very flawed but very intelligent person. I mean, the fact of the matter is that you see Xavier drinking alcohol, and that's not something that you would expect. He's clearly using his powers and his ability to know different things about science to hit on women. He does pull a Superman 2 at the end, which I can almost justify this a little bit more because the guy was shot in the back, lost the power of his legs. He lost his best friend and a new friend to the quote-unquote dark side, so to speak. So I can at least understand Xavier's behavior a little bit towards the end. But I think the coolest thing about Xavier is throughout this movie, you actually get to see him be a professor. You get to see him be a teacher. He is a motivating factor in a lot of the young mutants as they are going through the training montage as he's trying to build them up. He does the same thing for Magneto. And I think that is something that we did not see a lot of in the first three movies. We never saw a lot of Xavier actually being a professor, and the fact that we get to see it here, I think, is a huge part of building up this character again.
Yeah, because if you look at like X-Men 3, and even though he's like teaching the kids about ethics, right, it's not really what we want to see. We want to see him kind of help control the powers and how to, we always hear the stories about how the kids kind of went to Xavier about help, like being out of control with their powers and him helping them, kind of get it under control, right? This is the first time we kind of see that, right? And it's great to see, and it's that scene with Scott's brother Havoc, right? And when he's trying to control it, like that confidence, or that he has to give like his confidence to his students, right? And so he stands right next to the dummy and says, "Shoot, I have all the confidence that you can do this." And man, like that was kind of powerful, because it really gave him that confidence, and from then on, he was able to control it. So you can kind of see like his power over people is not the mental thing, but in terms of like actually helping and inspiring people to kind of become their best selves. And you kind of see that with Magneto as well in that scene where he's helping him control the satellite dish. That's a really deeply emotional scene. You kind of tell he gets emotional too as well, and that's the kind of Xavier that I wanted to see, man, because we don't really get to see that when he's in the chair. He's just trying to be the protector of the X-Men and running the X-Men, and we never get to see him kind of interact with the students like that. So this was kind of refreshing to see that.
And I think when we talk about Magneto, I'm putting Magneto under the heroes, even though he technically ends up as a villain or antagonist. He's basically in a Quentin Tarantino movie for the first part of this, as he goes on a murderous rampage. And I think the reason I get the Tarantino vibes is both because of Inglourious Bastards and because this is probably the darkest X-Men movie ever made from a violence perspective. And I like the fact that we do see the friendship with Xavier. They clearly disagree on a lot of issues. We ultimately see him get his revenge on Shaw by just murdering him with the coin, taking the helmet. I really like what they did with Magneto in most of this movie, but I really wish that they had had another movie to develop the Xavier Magneto friendship, and they didn't right at the end of the movie just have the big heel turn. I think that's probably my biggest critique of this, is I kind of wanted to see more of Xavier and Magneto together before they separate, because in reality, to consider them friends, I mean, how long were they realistically together? A matter of weeks, if not at most months. So I think that is one of the biggest flaws of the movie, is that if we are to believe that Xavier and Magneto have this big friendship, it's not something that lasts all that long. And there's a lot of antagonism throughout even the middle portions of the movie when they are supposedly friends.
Yeah, I didn't really think about that until now, and I guess you're right. Like, there probably should have been more time for them to kind of develop as best friends. I get the reasoning for it, because probably in the next movie they wanted to start, pushing Magneto as the big villain. And then they really set it up with the helmet and the tease of the helmet, so that was pretty cool. Yeah, I just think that him as a hero, it's kind of refreshing to see that. I mean, obviously from the first three movies, he's always been the bad guy, and X2, they kind of teased him as the hero, but really, obviously the turn was going to come at the end, but I think you kind of needed that, because that's kind of what the people expected and wanted, because as much as we like seeing them together, people like to see Magneto be this badass and the bad guy, and to really do that as a good guy, you can't really do that, because Xavier's going to be behind you all the time saying, hey, you can't kill people and blah, blah, blah. So when he does kill Shaw, that was kind of, I actually agree that he should have killed Shaw, otherwise Shaw would have just gone on and killed more people, but Xavier's just kind of being stubborn with his ethics, so... but that's, again, a part of that disagreement, and that's part of that relationship, so that kind of ties into that. But I agree that he should have killed Shaw.
You're also a Man of Steel apologist, so this is not a surprise to me.
Yeah, I know, but hey, man, he built all that energy up, and then he was going to just explode a giant nuke and start the war, so I agree, and he already killed a bunch of people, so Magneto was right on that one.
If you say so. Let's talk about Beast and Mystique. They are basically the primary supporting players, and they also both happen to be blue a lot of the time, as they are played by Nicholas Hoult and Jennifer Lawrence, respectively. When Jennifer Lawrence was cast to this movie, this is just, and I mean just before she blew up, because I believe she had just been in Winter's Bone at this point. I don't think the first Hunger Games had come out yet, and that's kind of the thing that sent her into the stratosphere. So this is a big deal to have her in this movie. And Nicholas Hoult, also a rising young star, somebody who was a kid actor, perhaps best known for his role in About a Boy. He's since gone on to do some phenomenal supporting movie roles. If you have seen Mad Max Fury Road, if you have seen The Favorite, which are two very, very different movies, Nicholas Hoult is phenomenal in a supporting role in both of those movies. So I would strongly recommend that you go check it out there. You seemed a little bit negative on Nicholas Hoult as Beast, and while he is not Kelsey Grammer, because nobody is Kelsey Grammer, I think the fact that this is a younger version of Beast, he is not going to be as bombastic. He is not going to be as confident. And I think this is something where I think we're going to see him kind of grow into this role. But I appreciate what Nicholas Hoult was trying to do. It's really funny because Nicholas Hoult and Jennifer Lawrence actually started dating for real during this movie. I felt like Jennifer Lawrence had a lot more chemistry with James McAvoy on screen. I really liked their relationship and the way that they played off of each other. I think the best scenes in all of these X-Men movies, this version of the X-Men, a lot of the best scenes are between James McAvoy and Jennifer Lawrence. Even though I don't think Jennifer Lawrence is always great as Mystique, I think their relationship is definitely something that has been very consistent and very well done.
I like how they put them like together as kids right off the bat because like it's weird like we never get that sense of a relationship in the first three movies. It's almost as if they don't even acknowledge each other, and then all of a sudden they have this relationship, and again like that ties in with the timeline issues and whatnot. But it was so like unique because like the first 15 minutes I felt like Mystique had more to do in the first 15 minutes of this movie than the three previous movies combined, and like it more dialogue and more actual character development and the background between those two. There's a great setup, and it's that perfect thing where you know that she's going to turn on him because we know the history. So it's a great way to kind of set that up, and I think that's a kind of great way to kind of show like how you set up these past relationships and they kind of turn on each other, and then she ends up with Magneto, right? Or siding with Magneto. So I like that the way they set it up. My thing with Beast is that like I like Holt in this movie. It's just when he's growing into that role, well, that's probably because of the aging issues too, because they kind of don't age as much in the next couple of movies when they should be aging more, I think makeup wise. But to me, he doesn't become like the Kelsey Grammer that I even picture in my head, because if you watch Days of Futures Past, you see Kelsey Grammer in the cameo at the end, right? So Nicholas Hoult does become that bombastic character that we know and love. So I don't know, like it feels like he doesn't become that character, and the way he's portraying him, it doesn't become that person. But here it's fine because he's a young. You're right, he's a young dude. He's probably in his 20s, and he's not really have that confidence yet. But he doesn't grow into that role that Beast becomes, I feel, in X-Men 3 or towards the end of Days of Futures Past. That's kind of my feel, because I just don't see that the two becoming the same character.
All right, so let's very quickly go through the rest of the team, because Banshee and Havoc, I appreciate that they get a couple moments. I think the biggest difference between this movie and the first three X-Men is that even though Havoc and Banshee don't really have a lot to do, even in the training montage, they get to have the small victories, so to speak. And I love Banshee as a character in this movie. I'm really kind of pissed that they killed him off like they did before Days of Future Past. But I think the actor who plays Banshee is very good. Again, in a not so great role. The guy who plays Havoc is fine. I mean, it feels like he's mostly there to just shoot energy out of his chest and make fun of Beast, because of course it builds up to that moment where Hank McCoy is trying to make himself look quote unquote normal, but ultimately ends up turning himself into the literal Beast. We also have the two characters of color. We have to talk about this because, Brian, there is a significant historical event that takes place throughout the 1960s. Do you know what this event is?
Yes, the Civil Rights Movement.
And who are Charles Xavier and Eric Lencher stand-ins for?
Yes, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr.
So we have Darwin and Angel. And what happens to Darwin?
He dies in like the first 15 minutes after he's introduced.
And what happens to Angel?
She turns bad and then ends up getting killed off screen pretty much when you find that in the next movie.
Do you see what the problem is?
Yeah, I know. I was thinking the same thing. And the other thing, too, I don't know if you noticed, like, this weird kind of, like, editing cut when Sebastian Shaw comes into the room and then mentions, like, being enslaved, and then cuts to Darwin for no reason at all.
Oh, that was gross. I did not notice that really until this time watching it. I've hated the Darwin scene since I first saw it in theaters. I had not even remembered the enslavement line. Oh my god, that was so bad. And the scene itself is just bad. I really, like, what they do to Darwin is just absolutely awful. And they spend like 2 seconds talking about him before they very quickly move on to the training montage. If this was a worse movie, then this would push it into the pile of shame for me. As it is, I think it's gross. I mean, I do not like this scene, and I think this is a continuation of the way that X-Men treats their minority characters. It's just very, very shabbily done, and it's something that we're going to see throughout the history of this franchise. And if there's one thing the MCU absolutely has to do with the X-Men once they get them, in their hands and they start producing these movies is they have to treat the minority characters better, because they clearly have no idea what this is meant to be, an allegory for a number of different things, and they clearly don't understand it at this point. So that's almost a side rant, because I really do appreciate and like almost every other aspect. So despite my concerns about the way that they treat minority characters, which I think is going to hurt the story score more than it's going to hurt the hero score, I'm giving this an 8.
I'm gonna give it an 8 as well, and that's kind of my critique as well, because I noticed that too, and I know you noticed the editing cut right there, and I don't know why they did it. I don't know whose idea that was, but it's totally unnecessary. And I get they were trying to evoke that kind of, like, ooh, like shock and awe kind of emotion, kind of effect, and it just didn't pay off. It kind of felt kind of trashy. So, and then I don't know why they just introduced Darwin just to kill him. Like, why even have the character in the first place? You know what I mean? Like, you didn't even have to do that. And then the idea of Angel kind of just being there and then kind of flying around and not doing much anyway, except I don't know, fire breath. But even then, I felt like that was kind of like a pointless character, because you kind of almost got to know him, and then they kind of just went away. So like, what was the point of it?
Right, and I do want to mention a couple of other people associated with the heroes. I think Rose Byrne is a tremendous actor, and in a role where she does not get to do very much, I think she does about as well as you could do. And I want to talk about this fact, because we're going to talk about, there are a lot of that guys in this movie, guys who are in a ton of movies. You probably don't know their names, but Oliver Platt, who was kind of a big star at one point, but he's played a lot of smaller roles. He plays an FBI agent. There are a lot of tremendous, there's a lot of tremendous casting that's going on, and Oliver Platt is just one of those. So I did want to point that out before we talk about the villains, and I had to mention Rose Byrne because she's been very good in a lot of movies and TV shows. And I wish that she had gotten a little bit more justice in this movie and didn't get Lois Lane circa Superman 2.
Although that was kind of for her own good, I can see why, because otherwise she would have been just fucking hounded by the government for the rest of her life, questioned and all that kind of thing.
All right, let's talk about the villains. I love Kevin Bacon in this movie. He is awesome as Shaw. Even better than his performance is the fact that they give him so much style and fashion. He's not in some generic outfit. He feels like he is a product of the 1960s. He is evil, but he's not a cartoon either. I think very early on, the first scene where he's in the scene with Magneto, that's the only time I think they kind of hit a tipping point, and he almost becomes a cartoon character, possibly because of using another language. But I think Kevin Bacon is so good in this role, and this could have very easily been something that's forgotten or something that could have been generic, but it wasn't, and I think Kevin Bacon deserves all the credit for that. On the other hand, January Jones is easily the weakest performance in this movie. It is almost hilarious watching these first-class performances given by almost every major character, even by all the minor characters. There's some great lines, some great delivery, and then January Jones just comes on the screen, and it is bad. Really, really bad. And it's unfortunate because, like I said, everything else was clicking so well. Azazel's powers are great as we get to see him teleport around. He is, of course, Nightcrawler's father. Mystique is Nightcrawler's mother. We can get into that next week, but he's not really a character, but I love the way that they use teleportation in this movie. Almost done better than in X-Men 2 with the exception of the White House scene. I love what they do with Azazel as far as his powers go.
And it's so violent, like, not only that, he's got a sword, and then sometimes, like, one of the cool ways, I hate to say the cool way to kill a person, but visually it's like you've never seen that before, you know what I mean? Like, he teleports people into the air and just drops them. And that's how he killed Oliver Platt. I felt bad for Oliver Platt's character because Oliver Platt is such a good actor. I felt he deserved more than that for his character, especially the way he was, giving energy to that character. And then, you see him teleport with his sword, and all of a sudden you cut someone up and then teleports back to Shaw. So the way they did it was really good. Shaw, like I already said, Kevin Bacon, underrated actor, love his performances. Like, in the beginning, like, it was so dark, because I guess he's trying to, well, maybe it's just me and you who are fans of, like, Inglourious Bastards, right, and Christoph Waltz's awesome performance and epic performance in that movie, he was kind of evoking that at the beginning, right? And you kind of have to do that because, it's World War II, it's kind of depressing, and it's a sadistic character, so it's kind of going to emote that, especially with Fassbender being in the movie, who was also in Inglourious Basterds, in the movie being 2 years beforehand. So, but that's kind of a good thing, because it was kind of a PG-13 version of that, and that worked, and it worked really well, and it sold you on him as a villain, like right off the bat, for me at least, because he's very dark, but he's also performing really well, and he's delivering this German accent that's it sounds kind of fake, but if you think about it, he's just been probably alive for so long that he kind of adapts different accents, right? So, and then again, when he goes to the 60s mode, like, I love his hair. Like, his hair is amazing throughout the whole movie after that point. So, credit to the hair design, too. And then, like you said, his suits and all that kind of thing. And even, like, the submarine, the inside of his submarine is very stylish and stuff. So, you can kind of tell, like, there's a lot of thought in his, in his character. And, like, especially in his style, that's kind of how he thinks of himself, you know what I mean? He thinks highly of himself, higher than, normal humans. He wants to kill the humans. So, it makes sense. And his character, it's kind of like a Vandal Savage. Almost kind of the same kind of thing. But here, like, he gives it, life. And the performance is awesome.
Right, and I think the costume design is something that absolutely has to be mentioned for all of the characters. Even the way that Emma Frost, the way that she looks, I think that the costumes are pretty fantastic. And when she goes into the Silver Surfer mode, as I'm going to call it, like, I think that's so well done, and it looks really, really spectacular. And I think that also contributes to the villain score. It's also going to contribute to the technical score. Despite the fact that I'm not a fan of January Jones, there are a number of performances, a lot of small performances, that I want to highlight. There is a great list of that guys, as I mentioned before. You had Glenn Morshower as Colonel Hendry. He has been in the military in so many movies and TV shows that I could probably list it for days. James Remar, who was in Dexter and played Raiden in the awful Mortal Kombat sequel, was a U.S. general. Matt Craven as the CIA director. Ray Wise as the Secretary of State. And, of course, Michael Ironside, who... This isn't even a particularly good line, but the moment when Michael Ironside looks around at his commanders and says, "Gentlemen, it's been an honor serving with you," makes me bust out laughing every time, and I don't know why.
Man, I don't know why, but that scene really, like, it's that doesn't make me laugh, but it really sells, like, the drama of the situation, and he's great, and come on, I love him in Total Recall. Do you love Total Recall? I love Total Recall. So him, yeah, Michael Ironside, loved it, and I love that they picked these little side actors that we kind of know, and that whole tie-in. And you mentioned the general, man. I was like, oh my god, is that the general from the Transformers movies? But thinking, like, because I've seen him in that uniform so many different times in so many different movies, like, it kind of felt like, is this the same universe, like, for a split second? But then you realize he's just playing the same role. So credit to them. I'm giving it an 8. I would have gave it a 9, but you're right. January Jones just takes a full point down for me. And that kind of sucks, but you kind of see why that she was kind of cut from the next movie as well.
Yeah, I'm also going to go with an 8, more so because I think the other that guys are so good that it almost atones for whatever January Jones is not doing in this movie. And of course, Kevin Bacon is also worth highlighting as well. Let's talk about the story, which I think this is probably one of the best stories in these X-Men movies, because it goes back to a time when mutants are almost completely and relatively unknown. We see Xavier discovering Mystique in the kitchen when they're both young. I think this is a great introduction to both of them, because we get to see Mystique using her powers probably for one of the first times. We also see how powerful Xavier is right from the start. We see Magneto being tortured by Shaw in Germany after dealing with the Holocaust. I mean, poor Magneto. You can almost see why he's going through this. And again, there's a little bit of back and forth as Magneto is doing his vengeance and Xavier is sort of rising through the ranks. Xavier graduates with a PhD. We see a lot of tension with Raven. Raven is hiding as a quote-unquote normal-looking person instead of being blue. So what do you think of this first 20 minutes to a half hour as they're kind of rotating between Xavier and Magneto?
I think it's really interesting that they built all this up in the first 30 minutes and got more out of this, like, relationship and got more emotion, like an emotional connection with the audience than I think the previous 3 movies again. Like, I think even when they play chess in the original trilogy, you don't feel this connection as much as you do here. I don't know what it is, man. like I love these characters more as the younger versions, I think, and I think it's just because we got to know them so well, you know, and like seeing the dark history of Magneto. Really, I mean, even when you get to Apocalypse, which is even like just as dark, that one scene, which is the best scene of the whole movie. You know, Magneto's dark history is just so it's sad, man. And then you also see like this thing about like, which they never really touched on before, but like you see that Xavier comes from like very extreme privilege, very extreme, to the point where like he just lets Raven come in and move in with her like 5 minutes after he meets her, right? And that's probably because of that feeling of, you know, not being alone in the universe anymore and finding someone else with superpowers and stuff like that. But also you see where Magneto comes from, and he came from the Holocaust, and he came from like being basically poor, being like in a tortured slave kind of role. Very different backgrounds, you know, and that's kind of the first time that I really realized that they really emphasize the backgrounds of these two and how much it really, you know, influences their character and their judgment. And that's probably why that, you know, because Xavier comes from this, you know, humble, not necessarily humble, but like rich background where he's kind of giving, like, you know, he probably has this thinking mindset where like he doesn't want to kill people, he wants to be nice to people, he wants to do the best for people. Or on the other hand, Magneto's seen a lot of shit and he's killed people and he's been an assassin and he knows what he needs to be done. You know, that's why I agree with what he did at the end. So I like that dichotomy, or whatever you want to call it, like that, those split views of the world and how they both came from like different, you know, parts of the world and how it affects their decision making. So I thought that was great.
Right, and Xavier is in a position of privilege to be able to do a lot of these things. Having the mansion, having the school, being able to go and get a PhD, go to school. There is a throwaway line when Mystique mentions the fact that she is majoring in waitressing, and perhaps a lot of that is because of the fact that she is not able to go to school because she can't afford it. I mean, you're talking about the 1960s. Not everybody was going to college in the 1960s, especially for young women. It would have been extremely difficult for her to go into college because they would have expected her to find a husband and get married and then leave college. So it is something that is very different, and not something that probably gets addressed enough in these comic book movies is the idea of class. We have these allegories for race and perhaps even sexuality, as Bryan Singer's talked about with some of these X-Men movies, but there is a class element that is not being addressed, as Magneto is very clearly kind of from a lower class or a blue-collar background, and Xavier is quite obviously a part of the 1%, so to speak, and that is going to affect their viewpoint. In talking about the rest of this movie, this becomes almost a James Bond movie, as Sebastian Shaw, in a lot of ways, is a James Bond villain. The government needs help with Shaw, who is a mutant, and they decide to recruit Magneto and Xavier. I think there are two tremendous scenes that I want to talk about. The first one is the recruitment, and this leads to the best cameo and the best use of Wolverine, perhaps, as they recruit Angel and Havoc and some of the others. But they try to recruit Wolverine, and what happens, Brian?
Go fuck yourself.
Probably the best use of an F word in a PG-13 movie, perhaps ever?
Maybe we're just not thinking of them all, but it just seems like all the best FU moments in PG-13 movies have been Wolverine.
I would almost have to agree. I remember in the theater at this time, people laughed their asses off because it was unexpected. Because, yeah, this is a PG-13 movie. You're basically allowed one F word, so you got to really have one locked in the chamber. And even in the first three X-Men movies, there was not a lot of swearing. But in this case, it came completely out of nowhere, and the audience was just laughing for a good solid 2 minutes. And what a great use of Wolverine. What a great acknowledgement. But clearly, not having him in this movie, I think, was a huge positive. But if you're going to use Wolverine, this is the way to use him.
And at least it fit the timeline, right? Because him in the 60s, he wasn't quite in Vietnam quite yet, probably.
Certainly not. And the other thing I want to talk about is the needle drops in this movie, because they could have gone very obvious. They did that in X-Men Apocalypse with some of the needle drops, but in this case, they were choosing songs that were very clearly from the 1960s, but they were not as recognizable and almost cliched as some of them. And I appreciated that in some of these montages.
Yeah, and I don't know if this might blow your mind, but I immediately recognized the song from the montage, for the recruiting montage. It's actually a reworking of a Gnarls Barkley song from like 2007, I think. It's called Run. I believe that's the name, but it's definitely that. It's the same beat. They just rework it, but because they're like such a well, in 2007, right? And like it was modern then, but they have a retro sound, so that's why it sounds like that. But everything else was kind of like, you know, old school songs and stuff, especially when they were having fun in the community room or whatever you want to call it, when they were giving each other names. That was an authentic 60s song, obviously, but just a little like side note Easter egg, that was actually a Gnarls Barkley song, which is CeeLo Green, and I forget the other guy.
And you did mention that scene in the community room. I know that one of the things you love about superhero movies is when they get drunk. In this case, they're too young to get drunk, so I guess they're drinking soda pop, perhaps. But they're just being kids, and I think this is the kind of scene that was missing from the first three X-Men movies. Is I think part of what you have to do is this concept of found family, this concept of building an ensemble and a community. And they really haven't done that. But here they actually took the time to do that. And despite the fact that I don't like what happens with Darwin and Angel, I really like the fact that they try to do something with these characters. They razz each other a little bit. They make a few jokes that are perhaps a little bit risque. But I really enjoyed those moments of this movie.
Yeah, and you're right, it needed that because it lets you get to know them and get to, you know, get that feel for them, and then, you know, see them at kind of when they're kind of vulnerable a little bit and how they react to it, you know what I mean? Like, especially with Beast and how he kind of reacts, kind of being made fun of first, and then by the time at the end of the movie he turns into Beast, it kind of comes full circle with that moment and then kind of gets back at him a little bit, so that was kind of cool. But I love that scene a lot, and you're right, they're drinking soda pop, but you need that, you know what I mean? It kind of lets loose, the characters kind of let loose, your actors kind of get to let loose. And then you kind of, you know, go from there and then drop the ball and something dramatic happens, right? But it's also funny that they broke the glass twice in the same room.
Definitely. And then once we get Darwin's death, we go almost immediately into the training montage. I've seen a lot of training montages, but I think this is one of the better ones because, again, we see Xavier and his behavior towards the students and the way that he helps to build them up. And I just really, really appreciated it. And I think the final 20 minutes, I think there's some positive elements. I think there's some clunky elements as they're clearly going for a parallel with history and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Magneto decides to murder Shaw. The visualization of that from a storytelling perspective was unbelievable because you saw his death from the perspective of both Shaw and Charles Xavier, who was in the mind of Shaw. So the way that that was done, I think, was so good, and we'll talk perhaps more about it in the technical aspect. But then we kind of hit the checklist as Magneto does the big heel turn, Mystique does the big heel turn, and Xavier is accidentally hit by an errant bullet courtesy of Moira McTaggart. And Moira, why was she shooting the gun? I mean, come on, man.
I kind of get what she was trying to do. I think she was just trying to overt, I think the word I'm looking for. But the missiles that Magneto was controlling, shooting back at the ships, I think her goal was to at least divert it so that the missiles will go away. By doing that, he's kind of... I mean, she knows that he can control metal, right? So I think it was just to distract him, to be honest. But it was just like a bad kind of timing and everything with it, and unfortunately he gets shot in the back, and then he loses feeling in his legs, and yada yada yada. And then of course it doesn't tie in with X-Men 3.
It certainly does not, but I appreciated the fact that Xavier had these two important relationships with Magneto and Mystique, and everything kind of falls apart at the end, and he kind of has to go through this reevaluation, and it's something that would continue in Days of Future Past. But I think the story here is very good. I think there are a couple elements that I don't think quite work, but I think the interpersonal stuff, more so than any X-Men movie, and more so than even a lot of the MCU movies, especially in Phase 1 and Phase 2, I think the way that they were able to execute this was probably the best that they could have hoped for. And even though it doesn't necessarily go anywhere in future movies, unfortunately, I think the story here is very, very good, and I'm giving this an 8.
I'm going to go with an 8 as well, but the one thing I'm starting to notice, and I think this is just all the X-Men movies now, is I'm kind of tired of hearing this idea of a war is coming. A war is coming. There's a war coming. We've heard it in all these X-Men movies. And I think that was supposed to be the war in X-Men 3 or something, but they keep mentioning the war is coming. And then the Sentinels thing happened. And I'm just tired of like watching an X-Men movie and not using the phrase "a war is coming," because I think that it's just been played out, and it kind of it just reoccurs in this movie too. That kind of annoyed me. And the one thing I just started noticing is like if Xavier really wanted to save Shaw, he could have just let go of his control over him, and then Shaw could have just ran away or whatever. But you know what I mean? Like I don't know what he was thinking at that moment, or if he thinking he could even saved him. But even though it's visually like awesome to watch and like full circle and so poetic with the same coin that he wanted him to control originally when he was a kid, and then ended up shooting his mom, you know, very deep stuff. But you know, I kept thinking like if he really wanted to save him, he could have just let him go.
I mean, could he though? Because once the coin is there, I mean, that would have been a really tough thing to do. So I'm not sure if I agree with you on that one. We'll see. Let's talk about the technical parts. I think this is one of the best looking and organic superhero movies ever, and I mean that sincerely. We've got great costumes with vibrant colors. We got the return of the yellow X-Men uniforms, which I know you had to love.
Yeah, and come to think of it, like it's the best looking costumes in the X Men movies. Yet it's the oldest supposed looking. You know what I mean? It's from the '60s, right? Yet these costumes look way better than the ones from the 2000s. So what does that tell you? So I think that's the direction that these movies have to go, or the new, post 20th Century Fox X Men movies have to go. Like they have to bring back the bright colors, and that's what he wanted to do here, Matthew Vaughn, and he did it, man. And that's what I wanted, and I knew he was going to pull it off because, like I said, the sense of style that he has, and with the '60s, and you throw that in, it's exactly what I thought it would be. And they should kind of stick with this. I mean, not stick with like the '60s look, obviously, but those bright colors. That's what it needed. But then when Bryan Singer came back, it kind of went back to those darker colors. So that kind of sucked.
And even more annoying, Magneto's suit at the very end is amazing. I don't know, I did not remember how good it was, but it's such a vibrant red, and the fact that they went back to the muted red for both Dark Phoenix and Apocalypse is incredibly disappointing. But seriously, go back and watch the end of this movie. Magneto's suit looks amazing.
I know. I thought the same thing the first time I watched it. I was like, this is the suit that should have been from the start, because that's the kind of like the color scheme that's in the comic, that's in the show. It's, I would say it's borderline purplish, but like a reddish purple, but it's like it's very like royal looking, you know what I mean? Like it's very very awesome looking, and you're right. And for me, my score, I don't know. I want to say 9, but to me, like the thing that kind of threw me off was the CGI on the submarines at the end, like when it was rolling and stuff. It just kind of looked too cartoonish. I don't know about you on that one. The music again, also amazing as well.
I want to talk about the set design because I think that submarine, particularly, it kind of gave off this 1960s Batman vibe in a moment. And I think it could very easily be done for like laughs, because there's a moment when Emma Frost goes up and gets ice by literally taking a piece off of a piece of land. But it was just so well done and well executed, and the design was so good that I loved it. I love the music. I love the editing. I love that there are these two montages, but they both have a clear purpose. And they also showcase some of the funniest movies in the film. And that's really impressive to me. I think from a technical standpoint, I think this is the best X-Men movie, and other than The Dark Knight, this might be my favorite superhero movie, again, from a technical perspective ever. And even some of the jankiness of the missiles cannot take away the score that I'm about to give X-Men First Class, which is a perfect 10.
Okay, I'm gonna officially go with a 9. Thinking about it now, and especially thinking about like, I love it when they do the trick editing, and it's like old school little tricks, like when Xavier can control what people see, right? You can do a lot editing wise and get away with a lot of like cheap effects. You know what I mean? Like when they open up the truck and they're being inspected by the Russian soldiers, right? They're all hiding in the truck. We cut to them in the truck, but then we cut to the other shot of the guy looking, and it's empty. So little things like that, it's very smart to do. So I'm gonna give it a 9. I can't give it a perfect 10 just because I feel like the CGI was just a little too wonky at the end. And you're right about that scene with the ice. It just kind of looked a little too cartoonish too.
All right, the legacy of this movie. I feel like this movie has almost been forgotten by many, but I think if you ask people, I think this is still regarded as one of the X-Men movies that's excellent, and the IMDb score reflects that. This clearly revitalized the franchise after two awful movies. You look at what the actors have done, and I think that's part of the legacy scores, what some of the actors have done. James McAvoy, Michael Fassbender, Jennifer Lawrence have arguably become three huge stars because of this. And this arguably deserved to be the start of a Matthew Vaughn X-Men trilogy. And I think people still think about like what this franchise could have been if Matthew Vaughn had stayed in charge of it. So I feel like this is almost the weakest category, but I still feel confident enough to give this an 8.
I'm going to give it a 9 because it brought a franchise back from the dead. Like, the previous X-Men movie was Origins, you know? Like, after that, after you watch Origins, you got to be thinking, like, this franchise is dead, right? This was awful. They go back and they're trying to just give us these origin movies and it's not really working. All of a sudden, they come up with this new idea, you know, First Class. You know, at first it seems like a reset. It should have been a reset, but it just revitalized the franchise completely, and it brought, you know, Bryan Singer back for the next one, and then it tied in with the original trilogy with the Days of Futures Past, and then all of a sudden, we got a new set of X-Men, right, for this decade. It just set this decade up for the next X-Men, or for this X-Men franchise. Unfortunately, it's going to end in kind of on a sour note, but I just feel like, the what ifs, the what could have beens. It really saved it, It could have been a lot worse. We could have had no X-Men movies for like 8 years if it wasn't for this movie.
That is true, and I certainly understand where you're coming from in that way, but I think that the box office of this movie, and I think the way that it gets discussed, I do think it does get forgotten a little bit, and I think it's unfortunate. So when it comes to the final scores, I thought I was going to be higher than you, Brian, but I think you may have given a higher score than even a 42?
According to my calculations, we actually have the same score of 42.
So this is an 84, which means we have put our second X-Men movie into the Superhero Pantheon. This joins X-Men 2, X-Men United, and this time we are in agreement because your score was not enough, but mine is what pushed it over the edge, and we both agree that this is probably the best X-Men team-up movie ever.
Hands down, and like I said at the beginning, like, this is one of those movies that, I would die on a hill for, kind of thing. Because it's so fun, it's so emotional, and it's such a great superhero movie. It's like a great movie on itself, you know what I mean? Just you could show this as a standalone to a lot of casuals, I think, and it would stand out more, because it's something they could just kind of digest and dive into.
And this definitely feels much more adult than a lot of other superhero movies as well. And I think that's reflected in a lot of the dialogue. Let's get to the burning questions. Best use of Wolverine ever?
I don't want to say that because, I mean, how do you say that about Logan as a whole? You know what I mean? The movie Logan. That idea of doing an R-rated, Logan movie. Is that the best use for him? I don't know. But it's one of the top scenes because right off the bat, as soon as you see the cigar, you know it's him.
Well, it's certainly better than X-Men Origins Wolverine, X-Men The Last Stand, and X-Men Apocalypse.
Well, that we can totally agree on. That's for sure.
Would this movie have been better as two movies?
No, I think the feeling is just we wanted another Matthew Vaughn directed X-Men movie, right? But this was perfect as it was. Like, it told the right story for that time frame in that 2-week period or whatever it was because of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Everything just kind of fit it, and I like the idea they tied it in with the Cuban Missile Crisis because it kind of ties it in with the real world events. So it kind of, makes it like seem historical in context. So I like that aspect of it.
I like it anytime that you can put it in historical context because I think it almost grounds the movie in a way. So I think that's why this works. I still wish that Magneto and Xavier hadn't just broken up at the end, and I still think that there was enough traction here to do a second movie. I understand why they didn't do it, but just as a lot of my complaints about recent Game of Thrones seasons have just been things moving too fast, I guess I have a similar complaint here, but we are not here to talk about Game of Thrones. I don't even want to touch that one with a 10-foot pole. How are Cyclops and Storm in this movie as young children when they're clearly barely teenagers in Apocalypse?
Because Bryan Singer apparently does not care about continuity, and that's the only thing I can think of because he's watched these movies as much as we have because he made the goddamn movies. He should know these things because we clearly see them in 1963 as kids, but then if you do the math, you add 20 years to 83 when they're supposed to be in Apocalypse, and they're supposed to be in their 20s, yet they're in high school and their teens?
Yes. It's not good to think about the timeline of this movie or any of the other X-Men movies in too much detail. What is your favorite that guy performance?
As much as I was putting over Michael Ironside, because I do love Total Recall. Oliver Platt, man. Come on, man. Jimmy King, as much as we shit on that WCW movie, Ready to Rumble, I'll always remember as Jimmy King. And there's probably other things. I'm thinking, oh, God, Lake Placid. He was in Lake Placid. But Oliver Platt, man, he was such a clean-shaven Oliver Platt, too. I rarely see him clean-shaven in a movie. He was great, but unfortunately, they kind of killed him off too quick. I don't know.
Michael Ironside is my choice. I just think the way that he takes an absolutely nothing role and delivers that line makes me laugh every time. On a scale of 1 to 10, how excited... Now, go back to 2011, Brian. How excited were you for another movie after this one?
9, because I was almost convinced that they were going to do like a brand new kind of trilogy and Matthew Vaughn was going to come back and blah, blah, blah. But then, I heard Bryan Singer was coming back, so I was like, ah, shit. But then I heard the concept of it, and I was like, oh, they're combining the timelines and what? And then, then we got Days of Futures Past, which is really good in terms of editing and writing. So I think it kind of made sense at the end.
That is a movie that we are going to talk about in 2 weeks. I would say after this one, I was raring to go for another X-Men franchise, that's for sure. I think it's unfortunate in a lot of ways that it was not directed by Matthew Vaughn, but I was still very excited after this one because of how good this movie was and still is. I think this is something that holds up, and I think it is very different from a lot of MCU movies. So I think that's all the more reason to give this a watch or a rewatch. All right, Brian. So this week we have talked about First Class. One of the things I was going to do was attach the X-Men Origins Wolverine podcast to this one, but because we have gone long this week, I'm going to attach it to our podcast next week, which is The Wolverine from 2013, a movie that is much belialed, but a movie that I have a feeling you and I do not hate.
Yeah, if you look back and then watch this movie and then watch, because obviously a lot of people have seen Logan, but if you go back and watch this, The Wolverine, it really sets it up well, and you realize how much they were going for that dark grittiness, but they were kind of held back because of the PG-13 rating. So I think I'm going to end up watching the unrated version, so I think that might be better. So we'll see how it goes, but I think you're going to watch the regular version, so we'll see. But I think it really sets it up well.
Absolutely. So I am very interested. I have not watched The Wolverine in a while, but we are going to do that. We are going to come back next week and we will review it, and we're going to attach the X-Men Origins review to that. Then in 2 weeks, we are going to review Days of Future Past, which I'm very much looking forward to. But for Brian, my name is Jerome. Thank you so much for listening to our podcast this week. We will be back next week.
Unleash the Beast. Can you believe McAvoy said that? Who would have thunk it, man? Unleash the Beast.